Hi, my name is Gianna Liberatori, and I'm here to talk about sexism and poverty as obstacles in education. So, first, I'm going to talk about classism and poverty. Both of these ideas are huge influences on education and specifically on students in the classroom setting every single day. There are over 50 million children right now who live in poverty in the United States. And for the economic needs of these children to be addressed and met, then the distribution of wealth needs to be more equitable to those students, which leads me into this concept of school stratification, which is an idea that refers to the fact that in wealthy neighborhoods, the schools are well taken care of. They have all the resources that they need. They are high performing and have good test scores. The students are generally successful. They're considered the best schools. And lots of families want to bus their children into schools like that, even if they don't come from those neighborhoods, because when you look at the schools in those neighborhoods, in some lower income neighborhoods, those schools don't have the same things that the upper class schools do. They don't have the same resources. They don't have the same materials. They don't have a science laboratory or a library or a PE teacher. They don't have as good of test scores. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of students from poor neighborhoods are placed into tracked groups, which does not always match with their ability level. You might find a student of color in a low reading level group, even though they're reading maybe at a higher reading level than their peers in that group. And that's because when teachers have low student expectations, they don't teach as high level subject material. They don't feel like their students can be successful with that high subject material. And all of that adds up and adds together to this idea of the achievement gap and why this is even a problem in the first place. And ultimately, it is because these schools in these low income neighborhoods do not have the same things as the schools in the upper middle class or wealthy neighborhoods. In one of the videos that we watched, we learned that really for there to be a change, there needs to be a national reform. And students of color and students with low income levels need to be treated exactly the same as their peers who live in these middle class or wealthy neighborhoods. This is just not acceptable any longer. Unfortunately, until that reform takes place, there are things that people can do, such as donating to these lower income schools. In the TED Talk video that we watched, the teacher gave the example of how her students hated reading, or so she thought. She would say, "Okay, class, time to read," and they would moan and groan like she was torturing them. But she also stated that the books she had were from garage sales and from attics and from used bookstores. And I think to my own classroom and how that's very similar because I also work in a low income Title I school and my books are also torn apart and old. But then on Donors Choose, strangers were generous enough to donate a whole classroom library to her. And she got all these new nice books and her kids were so excited to read. And all they wanted to do was read because they had these materials and they had these resources. So one way that we can help students who are living in poverty is to donate so that they're able to have access to some of the same things that their wealthier peers have access to. Sexism is also something that influences the educational setting. One thing that researchers have noticed is that many people who believe in the concept of individualism believe that inequalities in society are due to the deficiencies in women and people of color, and that prejudice completely still exists, and there is more difficulties for women and people of color in these financial and career opportunities, despite people thinking that that's not true anymore. An example of that is that 95% of Fortune 500 companies are led by men, and more specifically, led by white men. Title IX stated in an educational setting that women and men can't be discriminated against in any educational program or activity that receives federal aid, yet women make up more than half of the college population and their sports don't receive as much funding as male sports do. And there are $50 million less in athletic scholarships that are awarded to women compared to men. A specific example from 2012 found that in some Division I football schools, that $20 million was spent on male athletes while only $8 million was spent on women athletes. So that obviously is something that needs to be addressed and continue to be worked on, and those rights continue to be fought for. Which leads to that final point, which is that sexism still does exist today. In the 90s, there was that idea of girl power, which was amazing and really led women to be strong in who they are. But at the same time, it led people to believe that sexism was not really a thing anymore because women had made it. Women were being successful. Yet, we know that there are still these inequalities that women face. Another point with that is this concept of successful girls, and that girls tend to be more successful in school than boys, and boys are failing while girls are not. But in reality, the research shows that both females and males in high income groups are at a solid reading level or at a solid math level, and they did statistically better than their low income and middle income peers, boy or girl. So that is another addition to the obstacles that children in poverty face. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this information was useful.